going to present today about trauma-sensitive schools and UDL. I want to give you a little background on myself. I am currently an implementation specialist for CAST. I support schools, districts, and states to implement universal design for learning. Prior to that, I was a clinical social worker, a teacher, and I spent 15 years as a school leader of 2 alternative high schools in Boston. And those high schools in Boston were for out of cohort graduation, which means the students were over age for their grade, and many of them were returning to school. They were low-income households, primarily students of color, and we implemented a trauma-sensitive school environment, a competency-based curriculum, and career explorations for credit during that time. So this mixture of experience made me want to explore the connections between trauma-informed practices and UDL, and these 2 frameworks support one another very closely. And I've spent a lot of time implementing them in a school environment, and so I'll be sharing some of my experiences with that as we go along. Our goals for today, our learning goals are to 1, understand the impact trauma has on learning, and to 2, understand racialized trauma, to 3, understand the key concepts of trauma-sensitive practices and to connect those trauma-sensitive practices to the UDL framework. So I want us to take a minute. When we talk about UDL, UDL has a lot of neuroscience in it. And the neuroscience about goal setting tells us if we set our goals and set our intentions before we begin or embark upon a learning experience, that our neurosystem is going to highlight those things that we want to learn and make sure that we're paying attention to those. So I want to take just 2 minutes to 1, think about trauma-informed practices and UDL and what you already know about it, and use that information to set a goal. What do you want to get out of this session? So we'll take 2 minutes to do that. All right, welcome back, everybody. So first I want to go over some definitions of those 2 frameworks that we're talking about. So first, a trauma-informed environment is defined as an organizational structure and treatment framework that involves building flexible environments based on understanding, recognizing, and responding to the impact and the effects of all types of trauma. And universal design for learning is an educational framework based in research on the learning sciences that guides the development of flexible learning designs and learning environments that can accommodate individual learning differences so that all students can learn. So take another minute or so and think about what are the connections you're making between these 2 frameworks. You can do that by chat, or you could do that by writing in your own notebook, or if you happen to be with someone in the same room, you can have a quick conversation about that. So let's just take 1 minute to do that. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to go into some descriptions of trauma, and I wanted to give a little warning. This is a best practice for trauma-informed environments to make sure that folks know what's coming up that might trigger them or might have some impact on their emotional health given their past experience with trauma. So we're going to go over some broad categories of trauma. We're not going to describe anything in detail as to exactly what happened, but if for some reason that is something that you do not want to be a part of, we'll be through this section in about 5 minutes. You can mute your camera or mute your speaker, or you can just close the window for a little bit and then come back to us. Just want to let everybody know we're just going over these broad pieces of trauma. So what is trauma? It is an emotional, physical response to an overwhelming, stressful event that overwhelms one's ability to cope. And it actually reroutes your brain chemistry. So it changes your brain chemistry after such event. And one of the reasons we're going to go over trauma really briefly and then go into what to do about it is because in my experience, I've been in trauma-informed practices conversations with educators. And then oftentimes a person will spend a lot of time describing what is trauma, leaving the educators feeling at a loss for, okay, so I know my students are dealing with all of these things, but I don't know what to do about it. So we're definitely going to get into the what to do about it section. So I just want to make sure you know that before we go on. So ACEs, what are ACEs? ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and the Robin Wood Johnson Foundation did a lot of research on this. And you can use that link if you go to your Sketch page and get the slides. You'll have a live link to that website where you can learn more about it. But those ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, are grouped into 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So when we're talking about abuse, about 28.3% of the respondents of this study reported having physical abuse in their background. 20.7% reported having sexual abuse in their background, and 10.6% reported having emotional abuse in their background. In terms of neglect, 14.8% reported emotional neglect, and 9.9% reported physical neglect. And then household dysfunction is another big group of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And so about 27% reported having household substance abuse in their household. 23.3% reported parental divorce. 19.4% reported household mental illness. And 12.7% reported mother treated violently. And lastly, 4.7% reported having an incarcerated member. So when you put all this together, how prevalent really are these adverse childhood experiences? Well, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found that 61% of the respondents in the US have experienced at least one of these childhood experiences. And not added into that is vicarious traumatic experiences. Those are traumatic experiences where you're witnessing things in your community. Some of those household had witnessing traumatic experiences in your house, but witnessing them in your community is not involved as part of that study. And then racialized trauma was not measured as part of that study. So I wanted to go over a little bit about what is racialized trauma, because CAST is really moving into making sure that we have an eye towards equity when we're doing these trainings and thinking about instruction. So racialized trauma and thinking about what impact that has on learning is a big part of that. So racialized trauma is the cumulative effect of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. So how does that work? There are negative narratives in the world and in societies about people of color, particularly boys of color. And because of these negative narratives, the majority culture takes these dangerous actions towards these individuals, leaving them having harmful internal feelings and sometimes destructive external reactions. And not only does this cause stress, but those destructive external reactions are viewed not as it might be for another group of people, a regular response to trauma, but instead it feeds back into that negative narrative and makes that cycle continue. So I wanted to point people who want to know more about racialized trauma and what to do about it to this Forward Promise paper called Disrupting Dehumanization, and the link is in your slides. I learned about this at the COSBEC conference. This is the Coalition for Schools Educating Boys of Color, so I would recommend that conference to folks. But this is an interesting paper that will help you give you a little bit more context about what that dehumanization is of boys of color and how this racialized trauma works. So the next section, we're going to go into what's trauma's impact on the brain. However, I wanted to do a quick UDL overview before, because what does that mean for instruction? What does that mean for UDL? Are things that I want you to be thinking about as we go through what is trauma's impact on the brain. So one of the first core concepts of UDL, which comes from those learning sciences, is that variability is the norm. We know that there is no average brain. Every brain is unique as a fingerprint. And human variability exists between individuals, but also within them. And that's where another one of our core concepts is that variability is contextual. I might prefer one type of learning in math than I do in English. So it depends on my context as to how I will be able to learn. It also depends on your context day to day. And that's where some of that trauma comes in. What happened that morning, and then how am I able to learn, or what are the choices I want to make? Another core concept that you'll see that we talk about when we talk about trauma-informed practices is the barriers in the environment, not the learner. So when we go into trauma-informed practices, I want you to really think about, where is the focus? Where are we putting the focus of our redesign? Are we putting it on the learners? Are we putting it in the environment? And lastly, one of our core concepts is that variability is predictable and learning can be designed for. So we can design for variability within learning. This is where UDL really, where the rubber meets the road for UDL, and this is the foundation of the UDL guidelines. And the UDL guidelines are built on three neural networks in the brain. So we like to say if your brain is a fist, this back of your brain is the recognition network. This is where individuals take in information and make usable knowledge of it, and it's what we call the what of learning. This front part is the strategic network. It's where individuals decide how they're going to act upon their understanding, and we call it the how of learning. And this middle network, which we'll talk about all the networks, but we'll focus in a little bit more on this affective network. This affective network is the why of learning, but that affective network is where we regulate our emotions, and it's where our fight or flight response lives, and it's where we really think about why am I interested in this, and is this important to me, and is there something else dangerous happening that I need to focus on with this affective network instead of the learning. And that becomes important when we talk about trauma-sensitive school environments, because if your affective network is overwhelmed with other things, then it's not available for learning. And the studies will show us that if your affective network is not engaged in the learning, that you are able to recreate that skill or that knowledge back in that classroom environment, but you are neurobiologically less likely, in some cases unable, to transfer that skill to a new environment. So that's why it's super important to think about that affective network when we think about trauma. So what are the impacts that trauma has on learning? And I tried to put them into the UDL principles so we can sort of start to organize the two frameworks together. So under the engagement principle, what does trauma do for the foundations of learning? It impairs people's understanding of cause and effect relationships. It has an impact on individuals' sense of self and perspective taking. And we saw this a lot in our trauma-informed school. A lot of our students were impacted by trauma, and a lot of them had some difficulty when it came to understanding the other side of a situation. And you had to work through that and had to work on that a little bit more with individuals who have been impacted by trauma. It also impacts your ability to identify and differentiate between emotions. So sometimes, because your affective network is overwhelmed, you can't make sense of what emotions are happening in other people around you, or in some cases, in yourself. We had a student that would always present as angry all the time when many other emotions were going on. And I'll tell a little bit more about her as we get into what we did to build a trauma-sensitive school environment. But she definitely had that impact of trauma. Sometimes it impacts your understanding and of the mental states and the feelings of others, and it impacts your ability to feel empathy. When we think about the perception network, your ability to take in information and turn it into usable knowledge, trauma has an impact on the language centers of the brain. So it's more difficult for individuals who are impacted by trauma to use language and to relate to other people. It is more difficult to read verbal and nonverbal cues, to process oral and written information, and to put things in sequence, or to remember things. Sometimes it's harder to remember things if your brain functions have been overwhelmed by trauma. When we think about the action and expression principle, remember that principle was where we're doing strategy, we're thinking about plans. And so trauma has an impact on that part of the brain, and that it is more difficult to set goals, to develop a plan, and to monitor progress when you're impacted by trauma, and in some cases still dealing with that trauma. And then when we think about academic performance, we're back to the engagement principle on academic performance. It impacts attention, engagement, and transitions. And that's because that affective network is overwhelmed. It's focused on other things, so it cannot focus on the learning. And some of that has implications for behavior. When we think about trauma and what does that look like when a student is impacted by trauma, what does it look like in their behavior? Sometimes they'll have heightened reactions. We're always very careful when we did sign-in at the trauma-informed school to make sure to say, welcome, we're so glad you're here, no matter what time the individual arrived to school, because sometimes if a student is impacted by trauma and you start off with negativity, you're late, why were you late, then you get you will sometimes get a 10 reaction to a 3 stimuli. Those students are hypervigilant. Sometimes they are defiant. Sometimes students impacted by trauma can withdraw. So you have students that will externalize some of what's happening with them, and the students that will internalize it. So some that will be defiant and some that will withdraw. Some students will go to perfectionism in terms of trying to find a way to make sense of their environment. Some students become perfectionists because they want to make sure that they have control, and if they can be the best student, the best person, then maybe some of these other things wouldn't impact them as much. And then hyperactivity, reactivity, and impulsiveness tends to be some characteristics of students who have been impacted by trauma, and they have rapid and unexpected emotional shifts because of those changes that have happened to their brain and some of the things that have happened in their lives. Because of these things, it also has an impact on relationships. So it's harder for students to build trust with other people if they've been impacted by trauma. And some of that has to do with how am I, if I'm reacting in a heightened way or I have unexpected emotional shifts, it's going to be harder to become friends with somebody like that if I don't understand what's going on. In addition, it's harder to become friends if I don't have a self-awareness of my emotions or an awareness of other people's emotions. And a lack of insight into relationships is part of that, and a decreased motivation to build relationships, because in some of these cases, these young people have built relationships with individuals that hurt them. And so that decreases their motivation to build these relationships. So that is a lot of information in somewhat short period of time. So I wanted to take a minute for you to scribe or to write in the chat. You can answer one or both of these questions. Let's take about 3 minutes for this. But what ways is your context, whether that be a school, an organization, what ways are you responding to trauma or students who are impacted by trauma? And what do you think would be the most difficult for you if you were an adult in a trauma-sensitive school environment? So we'll take 3 minutes to answer that question. All right, welcome back. So I'm going to go on and tell you a little bit about our trauma-sensitive school that we built in Boston. I worked for ABCD, Action for Boston's Community Development, and we were a nonprofit that ran alternative high schools for those students who were overage and undercredited returning to school. As I said in the beginning, many of them were students from low-income families and students of color, and often they were students who had been identified for an IEP. So we shifted University High, the first school I worked at, towards a trauma-sensitive school environment, and then when we had an opportunity to build a new school program, we built a new school program called Dorchester Academy, and this was our approach to trauma-informed practices, as we we learned from University High and sort of adding on. So one of the most important things that we needed to do as a school to build a trauma-informed school was mindset shifts. So we had to, as adults, shift from fixed mindset to growth mindset. And this is particularly important when it comes to behavior and behavior management. I like to say that all behavior is information. So when you think about the way students are responding to your school environment or responding to your instruction, you have to look for what is it in that environment that is encouraging a certain type of behavior, or if it is a student behaving that way because there's something that they don't have an option for themselves within that instruction. So we have to look at behavior as information and less as behavior is something that students are doing because they want to be disruptive. And so we had to really focus and change our mindset to look at the environment and look at what we were doing or not doing to support that student so that they could be self-regulated in our school. So we had to move from behavior management to solution focused. So when we saw a student that was acting outside of what our community agreements were, what is the solution? What do they need to be in a place where they can act within the community agreements? In addition to behavior being information, we also looked at as lack of skill in some cases. So some cases, students were reacting to situations, especially when it came to relational situations between students and teachers, with the skills that they had. And so we had to help them build additional skills when it came to conflict management and conflict resolution. And because our school was a school where students came after they had been pushed out or dropped out of other school environments, it took them longer to sort of trust us and trust the process. So we had to be relentless in our kindness. We had to be kind and relentless in that kindness way beyond what we may have thought was a reasonable amount, because we had to help rebuild some of that trust to school with students. And in that same vein, there's a quote by Irma Bombeck that I really like, which is, "A child needs your love the most when he or she deserves it the least." So you have to be relentless in your kindness to make sure that they understand that you want the best for them and you're not just there to try to impose some consequence. And lastly, we had to really challenge our own bias, because we tried to, for the most part, when we hired for that school, we tried to hire individuals that were from the same cultures as the students who we served. However, some teachers were not from that same culture. So we had to think about when we think, oh, this activity or this group of students is too loud. Well, it is too loud. What are we thinking about from our culture as how one should act, and how does that look like in other people's culture? And try to knock down some of those negative narratives that we talked about when we talked about racialized trauma. Try to dispel all those negative narratives and those negative ideas, and help students kind of to become more to rewrite those narratives and let students tell their own stories and refer to students as intellectuals. And another thing that we had to do was really think about those things that, schools have those rules, no hoods, no hats, that sort of thing. And we really tried to boil down the rules to the most relational piece. We need you to be productive. We need you to not draw anyone else from learning. But we weren't doing any arguing about hoods or hats or things that didn't distract from the learning, because that we wanted students to be able to show up as who they were and interact with our environment, interact with the material authentically as themselves. So that mindset shift was pretty complicated, but it can be in some ways all traced back to the barrier as in the environment and not the learner. So we really looked at our environment and how we could restructure our environment so that could support learners. And so what we did in terms of school-wide systems to make that happen is we had reduced transitions. So we had block scheduling, we did trimesters instead of full year courses, so there was a shorter finish line to finish your course, but also that allowed us to block the scheduling sometimes transition, because students who are impacted by trauma, every time they transition to a new place, they had to sort of make sure they were safe. They had to check around the area to make sure everything was going to go well. And so to reduce the amount of times that students sort of had to assess and be hypervigilant, we reduced the transitions in the school day. We also had a very predictable schedule. So because we did have some problems with attendance, one would say we should do a waterfall schedule so that the students can try to get more of those classes if they miss a day, or if they're late, they're not always missing the same period. But we kind of weighed that against predictability as being a best practice for a trauma-informed school environment, and decided to keep the same schedule every day so they could have predictability. We also had a competency-based school environment. So we had a competency-based program, and so that helped us to build what trauma-sensitive schools would say is islands of competence. And I think linked on one of these slides is some links to books from Massachusetts Coalition for students impacted by trauma. And one of the best practices in there is to build these islands of competence for students to help them know what they know and what they're able to do. And some of that we did by having this by having this competency-based assessment system for students. We also had safe spaces. We had places where students could go talk. We had many clinicians in the building. We had family and community engagement. And in fact, one of our family days that we had an ability, because we had a career exploration for credit, we had an ability to bring students in and have them be interns for family engagement. So those students did the internship, and then they built this this great family day. And some of the adults were saying, oh, you guys don't need a bouncy house, you don't need all these things. And they said, no, trust us, we need them. And that was probably the best family day, the best attended family day we ever had. We tried to have culturally competent systems. And then, as I said before, we tried to have representation in our staff. We tried to have the staff come from similar cultures to the students that we were serving. In terms of our instructional approach, we made sure, and this is part of UDL, but it is also part of trauma-informed practices. When you read some of the trauma-informed practices, best practices, we had multiple ways to perceive material. There are multiple ways to show your competence so that students could express themselves and really show up in that space. And also sometimes, because of variability, some student might be able to better show their competence in one way and another student in another. We had personalized learning plans, so students were only taking what they needed to take to graduate. They didn't have to repeat anything, and because of the competencies, once they've earned a competency, it never went away. So they were able to kind of continually start where they left off. We tried to have these counter narratives, so we had my history days, those sort of things, so students can sort of tell their own story and not have to listen to those negative narratives in the environment. And then we tried to build in culturally responsive materials and pedagogy in our instruction. And then the last big core piece of our program was our social and emotional support, our approach, and we called it the support core. So we had our 3 R's. The first R was relationship, second restoration, and then the third resources. So when we think about relationship, we had some training on empathy and trauma triggers for our staff, and staff training on building relationships, in particular relationships across cultures. We wanted all staff to leverage their relationships to support that relationship building between coworkers and students. So if for some reason a student responded to one staff member better than another, we leveraged those relationships and tried to build those. Help the English teacher would help the math teacher build that relationship with the students. We were all trained to identify trauma triggers for students and work to mitigate them. So whether that means trying to maintain a peaceful environment, allowing a student to choose their own seat. And staff met in restorative circles. So we did restorative justice as a measure for our discipline. You can do restorative justice when a discipline event happens, because the students are going to hate it. They're going to say, I don't want to go to circle because that means I'm in trouble. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have those circles happen all the time. So we would do those restorative justice circles in community settings. We would do them in advisory. We would do them to make decisions about student council and those sort of things, to keep that everybody has a voice in this place and everyone's voice is equal. We wanted to keep that message going. And you can do that through restorative circles, because you pass a talking stick around and nobody gets any less or more time than anyone else, because you get as much time as you want. And the staff also were asked to participate and be as vulnerable as possible to show themselves as humans and to be able to relate to students, so that they can show that if you come to these places, you're open, you're honest, you're vulnerable, and then you will get good things back from the circle and from the community. So in terms of restoration, as I said, we did those community circles and advisory. We did it for consequences. So some of our restorative consequences were school service, and we addressed those. We had more clinicians than many of other schools, because we were linked up with a nonprofit. We were able to pay for the clinicians through that nonprofit. So we had about one clinician for every 25 students. So very lucky in that case. And those clinicians helped us to think about those root causes for those behaviors and how can we mitigate for those in a school environment. And in some ways, how can we address those or help the students address them? Our students were treated as individuals, and students and community were held accountable for the agreements they made in the circle. So the students were able to say, I acknowledge and I recognize that I have broken a community agreement, and these are the things that I want to do to make it up to the community, and the community could decide if they thought that was right or if they wanted to add things, and then you kind of had that conversation, and then the student did those things to make it up to the community because they had broken those agreements. And our last R was resources. So we had those wraparound services, we had those clinicians, we had embedded in the curriculum the SEL, where we could help students with skills and executive functioning, coping skills. We processed incidents differently than I think other places. The student that I mentioned before, she had a big blow up in the hallway one day, and she had to come back in with her mother. So she came back in with her mother the next day, and we sat down in the circle, and their mother and her came in like ready to fight because they were new to the school. They kind of didn't know how we did things. And I think they were a little confused. Why is everybody sitting in this circle? And the first thing that we talked about was to this young person, we don't like for you to be so upset, and we're sorry that you got so upset, and we're going to try to do something in this meeting so we can think about how can we build a situation where you won't have to get that upset again. And she just broke down and cried. So she was coming in with all this resistance and defensiveness. And because we showed her a little empathy, then she was able to kind of process her emotions and then think about, what does she need? Does she need to take a walk, or what does she need going forward, so that she can get the most out of her school environment? We had the clinical counseling. We made safety plans for students that were going through things outside of school. So because we had clinicians, we were able to coordinate with community organizations and other community-based agencies to build in safety plans. We had a cool down area, and we built in as much choice as possible. Some choice around taking a walk, choice around what do I need for my self-regulation, so that students could be present for the learning as much as possible. I put in a little bit about our classroom incident protocol because every school in Boston was asked to have these progressive disciplines. So our progressive discipline was our tier 1 for everyone was relationship building. We were monitoring everyone, giving them reminders. Everyone got the SEL instruction and that safe and supportive school environment. And then as things started to bubble up, or we started to see people break those community agreements over and over, then the clinician was notified. We had to call home. Sometimes if there was an incident and the student had to leave class, they had a processing conversation with a clinician, and that clinician gave them some coping skills and talked about what they might be able to do the next time. Then if it bubbled up, then a teacher would request a circle. We'd facilitate that circle, put an accountability plan in place, and some of those accountability plans were daily reflection sheets or public apology or an academic adjustment. If some of our students would have more difficulty with self-regulation if their academic load was more or less than it was the right size for them. So we try to make those academic adjustments and include additional supports. So the school-based recommendations for a racialized trauma are, and I wanted to go back to this racialized trauma because I wanted to, some of that stuff is not shown, doesn't show up in the Massachusetts Coalition for Trauma-Sensitive Schools information. But one of the things that they recommend to mitigate for racialized trauma is what is called village raising, and that's storytelling. And so some of that showed up, but not specifically in regards to racialized trauma. When we talk about let students be authentic and let students be themselves and tell their own stories. Connections, so healthy relationships. So some of that was also covered in the Massachusetts stuff, but healthy relationships modeled, built, and maintained. Protection is a big recommendation to mitigate for racialized trauma, to make sure that boys and young men of color are physically safe, emotionally safe, and they understand that they are physically and emotionally safe in your environment. Have affirming healthy affection to mitigate some of those harmful internal narratives, and redirection. So guidance is offered to those who are thrown off track. So although it's not specifically called out in the trauma best practices for trauma-informed schools, many of those things show up in that trauma-informed schools. The other thing I wanted to mention, because as part of our symposium on UDL and equity, it was called UDL Rising, we talked about taking some of these practices for the classroom, and sometimes when we take those practices from the classroom, we separate them from the bigger political pushes from these frameworks. So another thing that the framework around racialized trauma says must happen in conjunction with some of these things that happen at school is that we need to interrogate our systems that deny boys and young men of color that connection, protection, affection, and redirection. And that's our child welfare system, our education system, our housing system, and our juvenile justice system. In addition, in terms of system reforms, things that we can do is share community knowledge about culturally responsive programming, listen to community feedback, interrogate the assumptions that we have about boys and young men of color, assess the effectiveness of these systems by evaluating to what extent they're achieving desired outcomes. And so the outcomes are the most important. If students, young men of color or students of color are not achieving outcomes, let's look at that environment, investigate that system, investigate the barriers in the environment so that we can create an environment in which those students can thrive. A long-term investments in financial human capital, and to change practices that adversely affect boys and young men of color, and then innovative practices and new policies so that we can take down some of these systems that is causing this racialized trauma. So for the last bit of time that we may have, I wanted us to do an activity. You can do an activity on your own. You can interact with the interface. But the questions I'd like us to think about is, where do trauma-sensitive practices fit into the UDL guidelines? So on the next slide, you'll see this is a UDL guidelines from CAST. And so you go to udlguidelines.cast.org and you'll be able to see all those UDL guidelines. So think about, where do trauma-sensitive practices fit into the UDL guidelines? Do the UDL guidelines fall short with respect to trauma, and if so, how? And what resonates with you about trauma-sensitive practices, and how does it relate to your own context? So we can think about those things together and share those things in the chat. And with that, I thank you for listening, and you can always email me. My email is on the slides, msanjeh@cast.org, if you have any questions, and I will be in the chat also answering questions during this session.